Every man is scared in his first battle. If he says he's not, he's a liar. Some men are cowards, but they fight the same as brave men, or they get the heck slammed out of them watching men fight who are just as scared as they are. The real hero is the man who fights even though he is scared. Some men get over their fright in a minute under fire. For some, it takes an hour. For some, it takes days. But a real man will never let his fear of death overpower his honor, his sense of duty to his country, and his innate manhood. Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. It brings out all that is best and removes all that is base. George Patton. Certified lunatic, that one. Well, we're going to talk today about Gideon. We've been working our way through Judges, and we've gone through the first four of the Judges: Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, and Deborah. And on the way, we've accumulated a few rules for ourselves about how to be masculine in a good way, how to be a good man, how to reflect our innate manhood, as George Patton would say. That speech that he gave is famous, and well, I don't necessarily think George Patton is the perfect and ideal man. He certainly speaks to the reality that it is not about whether or not you are afraid. It is about what you do in spite of your fear that makes you a worthy man. This is very important as we look at Gideon, because Gideon is the fearful judge. We've gone, as I said, through the first four, who are, as I've said in previous videos, kind of the righteous judges, the faultless judges, in a sense. You have Othniel, the perfect hero, the manly man, the perfect warrior. You have Ehud, who, although he exercised a different means of saving Israel as an assassin, he was without fault, and he did what was right even when all of the people around him wanted him to not do that. And then you have Shamgar, the foreigner, who we see nothing presented about his behavior, good or bad, except that he saved Israel in spite of being a foreigner. And you have Deborah. And Deborah was a woman, and Deborah ruled as a woman. She sat under the tree and let people come to her, and she tried to encourage the men to live up to their own obligations and duties as men, but led when required because there was no one else to do the right thing. But now we're into a totally different series of judges. We're going to see the flawed judges, and the book of Judges gives us a lot more details about these ones. A lot more is presented about the character and the flaws of them. There's a reason for that in the narrative. It's bringing out to us that even though a man might be flawed, he's still able to be used by God to accomplish good things. And our flaws don't make us useless. So we come across this guy, Gideon, after Israel has again, following Deborah and Barak's victory, fallen back into a state of selfishness and false worship. They're worshiping Baals and Ashtaroths, these foreign gods, and it goes back to the adage that, there was no king in those days and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so they have fallen prey again to weakness because they're looking to themselves rather than looking to the good of their nation. And the Midianites are coming up, and they're basically raiding and taking all of the food in the lowlands, all of the crops, coming in with a great horde of nomads on camels and eating all of the food, and the people are too weak to defend themselves. They're not unified. Obviously, as it turns out, they could have defended themselves if they were willing to sacrifice, but they've become weak and decadent morally, and so they can't. So we come upon Gideon as the Israelites are hanging out in the hills and in caves up in the high country of Israel, where it's very difficult to do any sort of military operation. And so the Midianites aren't coming after them up there, and they're just living in relative safety, but in absolute impoverishment because they haven't got access to the very rich and arable lands in the Jordan Valley and in the west along the coast and up north. And Gideon is found threshing out grain in a winepress to hide it lest the Midianites might come by. And an angel of the Lord comes and presents himself to Gideon and says, "Hail, mighty man of valor. God has chosen you to lead Israel to victory over her enemies." And that's an interesting thing because, the picture of Gideon is certainly not as a man of valor, not naturally so. So God is not speaking through this angel as though he is inherently valorous, but because he's going to use him to be a man of valor. Now, Gideon, rightly, is not so sure about this. And he challenges the angel and says, how is it then that you have let this people be subjugated if you are for us? And how am I to know that you are in fact from God? And the angel tries to reassure him, and then he says, well, wait here, and I want you to do something for me to give me a sign that this is in fact a commission from God. And he goes, gets a goat, some grain and oil, and then he comes and makes a sacrifice, burns it, right, before the Lord. And the angel of the Lord steps into the flames and ascends into heaven. So you're getting, this divine intervention into the life of Gideon. He's being called. And Gideon says, okay, well, I guess this is the real deal. And he's tasked by God to smash down the altars to the false gods. So he goes at night with some of his friends, and he smashes the altar or the idol of Baal and cuts down the pole to Asherah. And then in the morning, the people of the town are furious that he's destroyed their gods. And they demand his head. They find out that it was him. And interestingly, Gideon isn't said to have defended himself. His father, in fact, who he was afraid of, because it was evidently his father's idol, comes forward and says, essentially, who are you to defend this Baal and the Asherah? Let Baal defend himself if he's a real god. Then let him speak. Let him attack Gideon, if indeed he is able to do so. And in fact, if any of you seek to speak against Gideon for doing this and defend Baal on his behalf, he'll be dead. Basically, I'm going to kill you. So, Gideon is victorious. And the people are roused, and he sends messengers out to all of the tribes, and people start to gather to make war against the Midianites. It is interesting that, unlike previous times, Israel has not seemingly fully repented of their wrongs. They've just got fed up with the oppression, because they still have these idols about. Well, Gideon's still not sure, and he's still afraid. So what he does is he goes and he asks God for another sign. He says, God, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this fleece and I'm going to lay it outside. And in the morning, if you want me to go and take these people and attack the Midianites, I would like you to make the ground wet with dew and let the fleece be perfectly dry. So that happens. And he's like, still not so sure. Give me another sign. I'm going to put the fleece outside, and this time I want the ground to be completely dry, but the fleece to be wet. And then he wakes up, and the fleece is soaked, and he wrings it out and fills a bowl with water. He's like, okay, I guess it's time to go. I guess God's telling me he's in this, and I got to do this thing. Clearly he doesn't want to, right? Well, then God tells him that he is to send home everybody. We don't really know how God is talking to Gideon, whether, there's visions or angels are coming, or, he's just convinced in his heart that this is what he's supposed to do. It's not clear. It's not really important. God is speaking to him in some way, and he tells him, send everyone home who is afraid. So Gideon stands up, and there's 32,000 men, and he announces and has it carried through all the people, his message that anyone who is afraid, whose limbs are shivering at the thought of going to war, you're to go home. So 22,000 of the men go home, and there's 10,000 left. Then God says to Gideon, this is still too many, because if you win with this many, you'll say you won by the strength of your own arm, but I want you to know that it was I that delivered you. So you're going to take them to the water, and you're going to get them to drink. And all of those who lap the water like dogs, or who pick up the water on their hand and drink from their hands, those are the ones that you're to take, and everyone else you're to send home. So he goes down to the river, and everybody who wades in to drink with their head down, he sends home, and he's left with only 300 people who lapped the water like a dog or lifted the water up to their mouth to drink from it. Now, of course, lots has been made about that these men were the ones who were the most vigilant and therefore the most battle-worthy. But you're going to get a picture that when Gideon does win, they slay 120,000 men, according to the history here. And that's a sizable force, even though they're not a professional army. It's just a wandering tribe of nomads. Yeah, taking 300 men against that is insane. There's no way you could win, right? So understandably, Gideon is still kind of nervous, even though he believes that God's sending him. He's kind of nervous about this. And God says it's time to go, but if you're still afraid, go down and I'll give you a sign if you go down to the tents of Midianites. So he takes his trusty sidekick and they go down the hill, and he's sneaking about in the Midianite lines because they're not arrayed as a battle camp or something. Their tents are pitched all over the valley. And he hears through the wall of a tent somebody talking about a dream they had in which a barley loaf rolls down the hill and crushes a Midianite tent in the valley. And the person who's in the tent with this dream watcher reads his dream and says, that is Gideon, who is the loaf of barley, and he's going to tumble down this hill and he'll destroy us. That's what your dream means. And so Gideon goes back up and he's reassured that, God is in what he's going to do. And also, the men are afraid of him down in the valley. Obviously, they've heard that he's gathered 32,000 men and that they're coming to wage war. And understandably, they're a bit nervous about this, even though it's still 4-1. That's a sizable clash of arms right there, and people going to die, even if they win. So understandably, they're nervous. They have no concept that there's only 300 of these guys left. Gideon gathers his 300 men, breaks them into 3 companies of 100 each, gives them the part of the story you'll probably be familiar with, the pots, torches, and trumpets, and then they go to various places surrounding the Midianite camp at night. They blow their horns, throw the pots down, and light torches all about the hillside. Well, the Midianites are roused by the noise, and they, of course, in their nervousness, believe they're under attack. Well, they're not a professional army, remember, just a bunch of guys. They don't have uniforms. There weren't really professional armies in the main in that time, unless you were, the professional charioteers of the Egyptians or Hittites, and some of the Mesopotamian city-states would have had them. But everybody's just a dude with a sword or a club or a spear, and so they don't recognize that there are no Israelites there, and they just start attacking each other in the dark. And there's a terrible clash, and the army essentially beats itself to death, and about 30,000 men run away, believing themselves to have been overwhelmed by a major force of Israelites in the night. So Gideon pursues. He sends messengers out to the people in the hill country around the region, and they come down, attack the army and destroy the remnants, except for a small faction with two of the kings that escape across the Jordan River. So Gideon takes his 300 men, pursues those guys. Bit of a side note where he stops at two towns that refuse to provide for him because he hasn't slain the Midianites yet, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of whoever wins this battle. Not obviously aware that the whole Midianite tribe has basically been dismembered across the river. So Gideon carries on, saying that he's weary and thirsty with his men, but he catches up with the Midianites and they slay them and take the two last kings, and he kills them. And then he goes and beats the elders of one town with a bunch of brambles and goes to the next town and knocks down their tower and kills all the men who resist him. And then he goes back. And then something interesting happens, and this is kind of the crux of the story. So you've got Gideon, who's a flawed hero because he's a fearful guy. Well, then the people come to him and they want him to be their king and rule over them. They want the strength of a king. And he refuses and says, no, God is your king. I can't be your king. But he then says, but what you could do for me is you could give me all of the earrings from the spoil of the dead. And it then says that they all wore a golden earring because they were Ishmaelites, Arabs. And I guess customarily they wore a golden earring is essentially the sense of that. And if the males all wore golden earrings and you've just killed 100,000 men, that's a lot of gold. So he ends up with like about 14 kilos of gold, and he melts it down and makes an ephod, which is like a chess piece or a symbol of office. And the priests would have worn an ephod, or the high priest did, as a symbol with the 12 stones in it. So something like that. No real details of it. But then it says that the ephod became a stumbling block to the Israelites, and they whored after it. So they worshipped it. They came and worshipped the item that was the symbol of the victory that Gideon had led them in against the Midianites. And it also goes on to say that Gideon then became very prosperous and had many wives and lived to a ripe old age, and even had a concubine through whom he had a son, Abimelech. And what happens next is probably for another video, but Abimelech becomes a monster. He kills all of Gideon's other sons, and he ends up as king over Israel himself for about 3 years, and he does really rotten stuff while he is in charge and has power, and makes a real mess of things before he ends up dying. So there's a lot to unpack in this story, but we'll take it in kind of 3 different pieces. First, of course, before we even do that, we recognize the fundamental character of Gideon is that of a fearful man. He's not naturally a hero. That's important that we recognize. That's being said for a reason, and the constant re-emphasis of it is given for a reason, so that we might understand what's going on in the whole story here. So there's really 3 phases, broken them down to, forgive my dad jokishness about this, but the call, the brawl, and the fall. The call being where Gideon is called to come and serve, and how he interacts with that call. The brawl being the fight itself, in which Gideon goes down with his 300 men and then pursues them and destroys them. And the fall, which is in the end when he gives himself over to pleasure and hedonism and decadence in his own old age, leading to the destruction of his family, even though he lived prosperously till the end of his days, and to great destruction to the whole nation of Israel, as far as that goes. So the call, the first principle that I'm going to give you to add to our list, and I'll revisit that to where we are now, which is the first rule is have a king. The second, set yourself apart for service at whatever cost. The third is respect your wife and serve the king together with her. The fourth is don't let your weakness keep you from serving. The fifth, do the right thing when everyone is watching. And the sixth is don't make women lead. Well, we're going to add three more to this. And the first one is make sure that you're right. Make sure that you're right. If you're going to have a king, make sure it's the right king. We do have a king. Everybody does. That's the fundamental principle. This is our starting point in this conversation is you serve something. All of us do. You either serve yourself, you actually probably serve many things, but something is king in your life. You serve yourself, you serve an ideology, or you serve people or a nation, a family. Something is first in your life and you owe first fealty to. Make sure that what you're serving is the right thing. You see here that Gideon, when he's called, he makes sure of his calling. His fearfulness notwithstanding, this is not presented as something wrong that he did. He's making sure when the angel comes to him that this angel is in fact from God, that the source of his truth is the right source. Make sure that you're right. There are many forces, kings, that desire your affection, desire your service in this world. We have, this wonderful society of consumerism, and your first loyalty to material things is demanded strongly by the world that we live in. That you live for things and you serve the economy. Isn't it true that economy is like the first thing in every election because it's king? Do what's best for the economy. Whether that's through socialism or through capitalism, everybody is concerned to serve the economy. But that's not a very good God. It's not a very good king. If you're doing things based on it being best for the economy, well, the economy is not going to save anyone, and the economy is not going to prevent bad things from happening. It probably could prolong people's lives if it's good. It certainly can allow a lot of suffering if the economy is bad, and everybody prospers better when it's good, as long as the money is getting passed around. But the economy itself doesn't really serve that. It doesn't serve our spiritual needs. It's soulless. It's empty, and we end up, with a full belly but unhappy. Wealth is not worth serving. Those who are wealthy are not happier than you. They may suffer less in some ways, and yet suffer much more in others. How happy are the Hollywood stars for all of their wealth? Are their lives better? Are their marriages better? It's not very good. Make sure. You got to check. And how do you check? You look at the outcomes. Gideon waited to see a sign that this was good, that this was from God, this was from the good source of truth. And that sign was revealed to him when an angel stepped into the fire and vanished up into heaven. It's a pretty good sign that whatever you're dealing with is certainly not just some dude. And what the angel commanded him to do was inherently good, to save his people, to deliver them from that which was destroying them. So that's good. Gideon could have looked at his circumstance and said, every time we've served God, it's been good for our nation and our people. And every time we've served ourselves or these false gods, it's not been good. That's a pretty good sign. That's a pretty good way of checking if you're serving the right thing. If you a right in what you have chosen to serve. Well, of course, then you have a couplet there because he affirms that this message has real power, waiting for the angel to ascend. Then he destroys the altar to Baal, and and then his father challenges the people when they're angry about this to say, well, let Baal defend himself if he's a real god. Let him prove it. Let him strike Gideon down. Hmm, interesting. You know, Baal doesn't have real power. He actually doesn't have the strength to accomplish what he set out to accomplish. Maybe we shouldn't serve this Baal. And maybe, if you come to think of it, since we've started serving this Baal, life's gotten pretty rotten. Maybe that's not very good. Hmm. And we're not really happy. Yeah, there's a good sign. Like, I do have to ask the question. So many of you guys that I talk to are fascinated with Nietzsche and what good comes from following Nietzsche, this idea of the Übermensch as the ultimate goal, where God is dead, so we need to make a man into God by building towards this Superman that's going to be the ultimate manifestation of humanity. Um, okay. Well, did that work well for Nietzsche? Did it work out well for him in his own life? I mean, he kind of went crazy and spent the last years of his life in insanity, so it wasn't so great for him. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good philosophy, I guess. What's the fruit that it's born in the world? Hmm. I don't know, like, who was influenced by Nietzsche's philosophies? There's a book called My Struggle that, in the German, Mein Kampf. It's some pretty strong Nietzschean influence on it. The whole idea of Aryanism and whatnot, being the super race and striving for the Übermensch. Heard that turned out pretty good. Yeah, we should totally follow Nietzsche. Seems like a good source of truth, right? Well, okay, yeah, I'm being facetious and going to Hitler here, but that's actually legitimate in this case because they're tied into one idea. Yeah, of course, you could say Hitler was a Christian. Well, he wasn't, actually. Not even, I mean, he may have gone to church because he was in Christendom, but certainly not Christian influence in anything that he wrote or anything that he said. Well, okay. How about communism? We should, try to solve our problems by getting rid of capitalism because corporate greed is the real evil, right? Communism or socialism will save us. Well, you might want to look at the track record there, guys, because it's not very positive. Like, what? Make sure your source of truth is right. Make sure that it has real profit. I mean, what I would say is when I check my source of truth, I have seen the absolute real power of belief and relationship with Christ to fundamentally change who a person is when they're enslaved to addictions and every terrible thing, and make them filled with joy from being filled with despair, make them filled with energy and zeal for life. To me, those are pretty good signs. I did a video here earlier about uh, maybe consider religion instead of drugs for your psychological problems because, uh, yeah, in that one article that I had, the citation from 82 peer-reviewed journals that religiosity had a better track record for resolving psychological issues than any form of psychological treatment ever created. Maybe that's a pretty good sign that you might want to start looking higher for your source of truth. So make sure you're right. Make sure if you do believe in God and you want to found what you're doing in scriptural principles as a Christian, make sure that the thing that you're doing is actually from him, that the rights that you believe you should be serving is his and not a construct, because there's an awful lot of tradition and an awful lot of things which are wrongly incorporated into Christian thought. Capitalism ain't Christian, guys. That's it's neither for nor against, really, but it's not a core tenet of Christianity, nor is democracy. So you might want to consider that if you think democracy is the solution, it sure ain't. I can tell you that. We brought democracy to Afghanistan. Shockingly, not so good. When you worry about democracy, was it, I think, Mark Stein who pointed out rather cleverly that during the Arab Spring, that people should be a little cautious about overthrowing the military dictatorship of Egypt, because democracy in a country where something like 70% of the females are subjected to female circumcision might not look the way you think it's going to. Democratic votes from a population that in the majority thinks lighting people on fire as witches means you're probably going to have laws that light people on fire. I'm not talking about Egypt there. I'm just talking in general. Because, yeah, that's how that works. If everybody in the majority thinks that we should be killing Christians, chances are the government that's democratically elected will start killing Christians, right? If we think that women should all basically have 20 tons of hay strapped to their backs and work to death, then probably that's what's going to happen. So it ain't democracy, it ain't capitalism. It's Christianity is a set of principles founded in faith in Jesus Christ for living out your life. Make sure that what you think is from that is actually from that before you act on it. So that's the call. Make sure you're right. Make sure you're right. There's principle 7. Principle 8 is don't be too safe. Don't be too safe. What do I mean? Sometimes we can wait on a miracle. Sometimes we can wait for everything to be perfectly lined up so that there is no risk in what we're doing. That's not the way to do the right thing. Gideon confirmed that the calling was from God and that it was from a good source. But then he doesn't act upon that confirmation very boldly. He does act. At least he overcomes his fear to go and do something, and he does act upon it. But he continually demands confirmation until you can see that when the force is whittled down to 300 men, he's basically left now to rely entirely upon God to have his positive outcome. And it works really well because it's beyond anyone's expectation that it could possibly happen that way. Funny thing is, if you'd actually had 32,000 men, they probably would have ended up in a real battle, because the folks would have been able to find them and kind of rally against them and push up. But because there was actually nobody there, they were confused and they fell upon each other. My boss in Afghanistan in 2007, he had a policy that was basically, and this guy cared a lot about keeping his men alive, like a lot. He was very concerned for the welfare of his troops, took his responsibility for them to the next level. Not that he was a cowardly man by any stretch of the imagination, but he cared a lot not to be responsible for making mistakes that killed his own men. And he was utterly convinced that the only way to keep his men safe was by being extraordinarily aggressive and keeping the enemy off balance and acting sometimes with irrational levels of risk, using men as bait. I got to play bait on one operation where I had three armored vehicles with no dismounts and no friendly forces within a kilometer of my position, in order to draw people out to try and hammer the vehicles, because of course they could with anti-tank weapons, and get a high value strike. Made it look like I was just on surveillance there. And they'd already blown up, I think, 8 armored vehicles in that very area. Uh, so yeah, strung out as bait, but we'd snuck in a whole company into a defensive position south of where I was hanging out, um, right in the middle of a dense agricultural area. But we knew kind of where they were and where they were hanging out, so we put a defensive position between where they would most likely come from. Now, if they come from a different direction, it would have got real messy. But as it was right, and they stumbled right into the defensive and got hammered. And we put a lot of fellas in the grave that day, you know. And then when we did have situations where it looked like there was no possible way we were going to get out of it, without taking some real hurting. Like the time a tank went sideways into a ditch, lost its track, and it took us like 8 hours to get it back out. The enemy didn't attack because they were too afraid that it was a trap. And it was, if they'd come at us, it would have been bad because we had no good defensive position there. And at one point, even 12 guys, almost for sure, from the Taliban coalition there, had come up and were staring at us hard for about 15 minutes from about 500 meters away. Like, I don't see how this could not, how this could be anything. I don't see how they could defend this, and that makes me afraid because they've hit us so many times this way. We're just leaving, and so yeah, be aggressive. Don't be safe, because being safe is the only way for sure you're going to lose. If we had sat in our forward operating base and just defended ourselves, we would have allowed freedom of action to our enemies. They would have surrounded us. They would have hammered us all day long with rockets and mortars, like they did when they had a chance, when we gave them any leeway. And we would have taken casualties because they would have had time to mine all the roads, time to put IEDs everywhere. And anytime we tried to do anything, they would have been able to slam us. We had to be proactive, keep them on their back feet. Well, life's the same way, guys. Like, yeah, this is battle we're talking about, but don't be so safe that you never get married. Like, what are you going to do? I recently read advice saying don't get married before you're 32, because I've never seen anyone married after 32 get divorced, which is nonsense. But I know a lot of guys that got married before that got divorced. Yeah, well, exercise wisdom, but yeah, I don't know. I got married at 21. My wife was 19. We've been together now for just about 18 years, like in 2 weeks. And yeah, there's challenges in that. I mean, jumping. So I stepped off the ski slope and just started running downhill, down the mountain valley right there. You got to keep running once you start stepping off that, because if you try to stop, you'll just break your legs. But nevertheless, boy, what an adventure it's been, and a good one. And we have a strong relationship. We have a happy and robust life together. And I have 6 kids. Birth control's not 100%, and we managed to have our first child 11 months after we got married. Not by design, but by God's design, maybe. And now she's 17. And and it's good. A lot of challenges. Life with children is hard, but you can wait forever. You can wait forever trying to be ready to have kids, and you never will because you're never going to be ready for it. All you can do is step off the precipice and get running. Like that's the way it is with life. You don't wait for the perfect job. You start working, and then you take the opportunities as they come. You don't wait to find the ideal circumstances where now I can get married because I'm financially secure. Now I can have kids because I'm financially secure. It's never going to happen because you're never going to be secure enough. Because life isn't inherently secure, it's inherently dangerous. So just take the risks sensibly to some degree, but start living life. Because the one sure thing is that if you never live because you're waiting for it to be safe, you'll just die having done nothing. So make sure you're right, but then don't be safe about acting once you know what to do. So the third point that we have to look at then, if we consider that we've made sure that we're serving the right thing and then we've taken the risks and acted aggressively to win it, is how not to lose it again. And this is exactly what Gideon does, is that he sows the seeds of the destruction of his own family and nation because he has forgotten why he had to fight in the first place. So for your ninth principle, never forget when you have a victory, never forget why you had to fight in the first place. Gideon forgot this. And this is the point of that in the story. Like, he's called not because he's some kind of glorious man, but because he is willing to serve, because he's discerning, perhaps, because God just wants to make a point of using somebody who isn't naturally brave. I don't know. But he didn't personally choose this. So why is he taking credit for it? The circumstances came upon him, and then he's taking the rewards as though it was his own victory. Now, of course, he does turn down the kingship, but he does give himself over to the rewards and lives in glory. And even though idolatry was the reason they got into the situation in the first place, selfishness, turning away from the law of God, because of that, you end up having a circumstance where people are worshiping his silly ephod, and he's sowed the seeds for the destruction of everything that he worked for, everything that he was used to accomplish. Nations do this all the time, right? Like, go through history and you'll see most of the time after a nation has a victory over a difficult enemy, they try to reap the rewards of that victory, and they do it by removing their defense. And a great example of this, of course, is the First World War. After we won, the Allies, that is, maybe not everyone listening can say after we won, but after the Allies won the war, they immediately disbanded all their armies, sent everyone home, and they misunderstood what was going on. They presumed that the reason that they had fought was because having armies meant you were going to use them. But that is not the reason that that fight happens. The fight happens because everyone was being selfish and proud and stupid, and they all thought they could win something using force of arms and take it from the other people, and they were all ignorant of the dangers of going to war with one another in the first place. And then they disbanded their armies and then greedily stole from the Germans through a terribly punitive peace treaty, more or less ensuring that Germany was going to rise up and fight them again. Like, why do we do that stuff? Because we forget why we had to fight the war in the first place, or we never even in the first place understood why we were fighting the war. So once we have made proper discernment about what is right to do, once we've taken the risks to win that victory, don't forget why you had to fight it in the first place. This applies in everything. Like, apply it to your relationship with a woman. What's going on there? You give everything sacrificially to win her heart. You would walk over coals for her. You would walk in front of a bullet for her. You'll give her preferential treatment and all of your time. You're there in a heartbeat if she beckons because you want her. You desire her. You want her to be your wife, even if you don't realize that's what you want. You want to be bound together with her. And then when she is won over, well, like I mentioned, yeah, I got married 18 years ago. The work I put into that courtship to win my wife's heart, that wasn't the hard part. It was everything that came afterwards where I had to continue to love her sacrificially, and I haven't always done it right. And then there's work to do to try and win your way back in to a place of trust and love. Don't forget how you won in the first place. Don't forget why you had to fight. Dog's excited outside, talking to the neighbor. So there's this passage in James that says, be an effectual doer of the word and not just a hearer. For a man who hears what he ought to do and does not do it is like a person who looks at himself in a mirror, goes away, and immediately forgets what he looks like or what kind of person he is. You have to look at the things that you had to overcome to win your current situation. If you're currently in the midst of a fight, whether it's with, anxiety or depression, or to try and find a means of provision for yourself, to find your place in the world, someday you're going to be past this particular battle, and then it will be very easy to forget what you were fighting against and why you had to struggle and to stop struggling. The call that we ought to be called to as men is to remain ever vigilant, to continually strive for what is good, and never let our guard down because we have forgotten why we were fighting and what we have overcome. When you walk as a man, make sure that you don't forget what you're here for and who you serve and what you have needed to overcome to be in the place that you are. So serve diligently this king, even in times of peace. So that's basically the story of Gideon. I hope you found it profitable. If you have any questions, comments, please put them in the comment section below. By all means, let's have a conversation about this. Or if you have some insights of your own, by all means, throw them down there. And, we're not looking to be a big channel here, but I do like to have the conversations that we have and be able to kind of talk back and forth. So if you find this to be useful, pass it along and share it with others who you think might find it profitable. Anyway, we'll catch up soon. Take care and God bless.